time for questions at the end. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions, make sure you drop those in the chat box along the way. At the end, we'll take a look at those. But again, appreciate you being here today. And throughout the presentation, or a few places, we feature artists as well. And we always try to feature different artists. This is Stephanie Craig, who's a basket maker. You can see some of her beautiful work on the left-hand side. And she's a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community in Dayton, Oregon. So who is this Craft Emergency Relief Fund, otherwise known as SurfPlus? We are an organization that has been around since 1985, and it started with a very simple concept. Folks would go to craft shows, and they would hear about an artist that had an emergency, so they would pass around a hat and collect donations for them, and then they'd send the donations to the artist. And so from those grassroots beginnings, if you fast forward to today, we're going to talk about some of our grant programs. But basically, we try to be a strong support system for craft artists throughout all stages of their careers. But our primary focus is emergency response preparedness and advocacy. And I got a question last time, what do you define as craft art? It's a very complicated question. I would never be so bold as to say SurfPlus is the only organization to define craft art. But to more or less take a stab at that, we prioritize craft artists that work in some of the more traditional mediums that you may think about, such as ceramics, wood, metals, fiber, or glass, as well as any other strong evidence of handwork and 3D materials. So we have a more academic definition, a much longer one on our website. You're welcome to check that out. But the short of it is I've been in probably 200 conversations around what and what isn't craft. But these images in front of you definitely fit within that definition. This is Kenneth Melendez. He's a mask maker from Guajas, Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico, since 2018, since Hurricane Maria, has become our largest reach of geographic artists. And I will talk about that a little bit more in the next slide, but absolutely love these masks. They are traditional Puerto Rico. Kenneth has some unique takes on them as well. So I just want to talk primarily about two of our grants, the first of which is our flagship program, which was built around the pass the hat model, if you will, and that's our emergency relief program. And those are $3,000 grants to U.S. craft artists who've had a serious emergency. And that emergency can look like many things. It could be an illness, it could be an injury, it could be an accident, it could be a disaster, it could be a combination of unfortunate events that has now become practice threatening. It can look like a lot of different things. This program runs year round. And since I began working at SurfPlus, which was 4 years ago, the number of artists served in this program has nearly doubled. And I was just talking about Puerto Rico. Now, approximately 1 out of every 4 grants go to artists in Puerto Rico, showing the growth in our network there. But also around 50% of the grants are being awarded for climate-related disasters, when it used to just be 25% of grants. So we're seeing a huge growth in that area, which can't be surprising with some of the effects of climate change. So that's our emergency relief program. We also have a Get Ready program, which was born out of that emergency relief work. We said, wouldn't it be nice if we could give artists some resources to help prevent future emergencies? And so we created this program in 2017, and there are $500 grants for craft artists to do any sort of activity that will safeguard their career or protect their studios from future emergencies. And those projects can look like many, many things. Some folks protect their studio by installing filtration systems or taking other safety measures to prevent emergencies. Some folks use it for legacy planning, so for making wills or estate planning. Some folks do very unique projects, and we have broadened our guidelines since COVID-19. And one project that I like is childcare. You can use these grants to pay for childcare so then artists can focus on their practice, especially during particularly heavy seasons around the holidays, or if they're tourism based around the summer, to make sure that they're able to ramp up productivity and protect their career. So the projects are relatively broad, but we typically run 2 cycles of this program, one in the spring, one in the fall. The spring one has concluded. Our fall one will be around October 10th. So if you know any craft artists, please, please, please encourage them to apply. We're also having a special Get Ready cycle this summer that will open on June 30th, just for artists in Puerto Rico. We got some generous funding for that. So that's the only time we've ever held one just for artists in Puerto Rico, but I'm excited about that opportunity as well. So those are 2 of our grant programs. Again, emergency relief runs year round and Get Ready runs in a couple of cycles. And then the last thing I'll mention about SurfPlus is that we have a gifts in kind program. So we work with small, medium, large businesses that support the craft community, and they often donate to artists who are recovering from an emergency. And those donations can look like many, many things. They can be tools or supplies. They can be booth space. They could be credits so that they could go in a store and purchase materials. It looks a little bit different for each partnership. Well, last week I highlighted Scott Kilns, which donates 3 kilns a year. This week I want to highlight Rio Grande, a large jewelry supplier who generously provides us credits that go on customers' Rio Grande accounts. And those credits range in value, but basically they can use that to purchase whatever they need for their practice. So very cool program, kind of an extra boost for folks after they've had a particularly tough time. And the last thing I'll mention about SurfPlus is that the past 5 years, we've awarded more than $3 million in direct assistance to 2,000 craft artists. So this program has grown exponentially in the past 5 years. Okay. Now we're going to move on. Enough about SurfPlus. We're going to talk about business continuity. So what is business continuity? Basically, it's a way of anticipating and responding to events that might interrupt your business, or in this case, potentially your organization. That's it. It's a way, it's a methodology to try to see what's coming in the future, or respond to events that are happening and reduce your losses. So I'm going to share, I'm sharing some stats from FEMA and SBA. According to FEMA, 40% of businesses do not reopen following a disaster, and another 25% fail within 1 year. And the SBA has an even more intense stat that says 90% of companies fail within 2 years of being struck by a disaster. And so I want to give credit to our sources, FEMA, SBA, as well as Access, which is an organization or a company that put together this information. But business continuity is not only about getting your practice up and going as quickly as possible, it's also about saving lives. And so the survival of folks associated with your organization, as well as the survival of the organization, they may very well depend on your business continuity planning. You know, to further our business case around it, it helps maintain your operations and programs, it helps protect your employees and assets, and it helps minimize your losses. And as I was mentioning, disasters continue to grow in scope and size. We used to have 60 or 70 federally declared disasters a year, and now it's not uncommon to have 112, 120. So we know the likelihood of certain emergencies happening is growing. And I think these stats alone are pretty alarming and make a strong case that we should all take business continuity planning very seriously. And so we're going to break down business continuity into the kind of these 5 categories. Now, if you Google, and I suggest you do, if you Google business continuity on your own, you're going to get like 100 different methods for doing it. And everybody's going to have their own secret sauce. Some are going to say it's 4 steps, some 5 steps, some 9 steps, some 5 steps with 10 sub-steps in between. My point is everybody approaches it a little bit differently. So the way I've organized this information, that's just what made sense to me. But it might look different for your organization. It might look different based on how deep you want to go into some of these areas. And I'm going to say again and again, I'm providing resources at the end. So if any of this information feels overwhelming, I'm hopeful that those resources are able to take you to that next level. So let's start digging in about business continuity. If it was me, a lot of folks put asset and risk assessments first. I can see that point of view. I also think it might not be the worst idea to go ahead and assemble a business continuity management team. And so you're looking for folks within your organization for this team that have a detailed understanding of both the day-to-day and the big picture operations of your organization. And oftentimes that knowledge doesn't just live within one person on our team, it lives within many members. So you want to have a good sense of who those folks are. There's lots of advantages to having a business continuity team. Number one is that it increases visibility of the process. And with that, if they can kind of see how this plan is coming together, hopefully that will also foster a little bit more buy-in. I've heard mentioned many, many times, you also want to have strong senior leaders as part of this team so that they can leverage their power and get this plan adopted and operationalized a little bit quicker. You know your organization, maybe that's necessary, maybe it's not. But definitely something to consider, having some senior leaders as part of this. Another thing you might want to consider is having representation from each department. Every department has their own processes, their own resources. It's important that somebody has a pretty thorough understanding how things operate differently, department to department. Also, having a team spreads the workload, so it's not just on one individual to do all this work, which can feel pretty daunting. You can kind of delegate and figure out how to approach this a little bit easier. And then lastly, it brings on different perspectives. So if you have a bunch of different folks from a bunch of different departments that have different knowledges, then obviously you're going to get better information in, which is really critical to this process. So what's the deal with this planning continuity management team? What are they doing? They're going to determine the scope of the plan and its criteria for success. So team members will be assigned responsibilities such as collecting data, developing alternate response plans, and writing the plan. They should also be responsible for detecting and announcing the disaster events, initiating disaster recovery response, activating the business continuity plan, monitoring the situation, deactivating the plan, and then testing the plan regularly. We're going to talk about testing a little bit towards the end, but really critical step is to have a good way to test your plan. One thing I want to mention is kind of a pro tip. It's great to assemble your business continuity management team, but also recognize that things change within an organization. People may leave, they may change departments. It's not a bad idea to have an alternate for each of these folks as well. Or maybe the incident affects that person themselves who's responsible for part of this plan. So consider having an alternate for each person as well that can step in and has enough knowledge to keep things moving in the case that that person is unavailable. So just a little pro tip, identify your team, but also consider alternates for those team members. So you got your team together. That was fun. Now you're going to start thinking about your assets and your risk. Last week, we talked a lot about this in regards to artists and their practices. Assets we defined last week, but just as a recap, those could be structures such as physical spaces, aka where you conduct your work. It can be things like office equipment and laptops. It could be systems, which we're going to talk a lot about systems towards the end. So hold that in the back of your mind. Obviously includes the people, your staff, your board, your clients, as well as I added this in, even though I didn't see it in other materials, but I still think events are important. So maybe if your organization holds conferences, holds fairs, holds other things for the arts community, think about how a disaster might affect those events. So last week we also talked about risks. I read a few places that there are 4 primary risks that are a little bit more prevalent when it comes to business continuity. The first of which we've already talked about, climate-related disasters. I think that one kind of goes without saying, but also you want to think about man-made disasters, any sort of gun violence, any sort of chemical attack, anything that could be associated. Man-made disasters as well is something you want to plan for. Number 2, and something that we hear a lot about that terrifies me at times, are cyber attacks. I'm sure you've heard of folks losing their data or being held ransom to get their data back. Cyber attacks is definitely top of mind. And this is kind of an aside, but I was told by somebody who works in cybersecurity, you want to make it appear to folks who might be interested in stealing your data that you have the worst bike on the lot with the best lock. And so basically his messaging was put enough security behind your data and systems. It's not worth the time and effort of attackers to go there, and they will target somebody else, which doesn't make me feel good, but I definitely heard their point. So cyber attacks is number 2. Number 3, and this is particularly prevalent in some areas, especially if they have maybe not the strongest infrastructure, is power outages. And I think that happened to me last week to some degree when I was kicked off this webinar. And number 4, which is probably newer or fresher in our minds, though it's definitely part of our global history, is a global pandemic. So think about how your arts organization has changed since the pandemic. Do you operate differently? Are more folks remote? What did you do with all your data? Did you move your server? Think about the effects that the global pandemic had on your arts organization. So it's important to consider how these events would impact your assets. And there's some pretty cool tools out there. I didn't mention this last week, but there's also things called like risk assessment calculators, where you can put in a score. So if flooding, you consider a potential risk like a 7, you give it a score of a 7, but its impact is a 9, it will send you a score. It will put together a score for you and say that that's a 92% risk. And if you do risk assessments correctly, they can help you figure out how to prioritize your business continuity plan to focus on those with the highest scores. So maybe flooding is one of the top things that you have a contingency plan for within your business continuity plan. I mentioned resources at the end. I'm going to share one that has its own risk assessment tools, as well as a way to catalog your assets. So hopefully that's of some use to you as you're thinking about putting together your business continuity plan. So the next step has a fancy term, and it's really where I think you should spend potentially the most time in building your business continuity plan. It's definitely a piece that you don't want to rush. And that's creating your business impact analysis. A business impact analysis, otherwise known as a BIA, is a process for determining the potential impacts resulting from the interruption of time-sensitive or critical business processes. So basically, when you're putting together a BIA, they have all sorts of great tools and questionnaires that you can use. And you're going to take those and you're going to survey different folks within your organization. Often those might be managers, but not necessarily. And what you're trying to figure out is you're trying to get a detailed knowledge of how your arts organization operates. And so folks who are being surveyed might identify potential impacts of a business function or a process they are responsible for and what an interruption could look like. The BIA should identify critical business processes and resources needed to continue to function at different levels. So you're going to survey folks on your team, you're going to find out which processes are really critical, and then you're going to think about what sort of resources you might need to keep those things operational should an adverse event happen. And all of your research, all of your questions will end up in what's called a BIA report. And that's a document that that documents the potential impacts from a disruption of business functions or processes, as well as weighs out different scenarios. If possible, your BIA should also consider the financial impact that these interruptions would have, and you're using that information to compare it with the cost of recovery strategies. So is the cost of the event worth an investment in additional resources to protect you or to get back to operating fully quickly? So the BIA will also prioritize the order of events for the restoration of businesses. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but a BIA can look at what's mission critical. In other words, what sort of things could your organization not function without? Like you would be completely shut down if you didn't have XYZ. What are those things you need to have operational within 12 hours or so? And what are those things that can wait until after the incident is complete or potentially paused? And so a BIA is helping you prioritize that type of information, which helps you focus in on where your resources are needed most. Therefore, you can get those restored first. So again, I'm going to give you some tools on questionnaires that you can use to do a BIA. It sounds really intimidating. It's not. It's just a collection of data that you're putting into a report that is going to inform your conversations, which leads to making a plan. So again, business impact analysis may take some time. It's not something you want to shortcut. You don't just want to interview one person on your team and call it good. You do want to have a lot of different perspectives at the table for that phase. So I'll just keep hammering in that point. So number 4, you want to make a plan based on your BIA or business impact analysis. What resources, including people, facilities, equipment, materials, or information technology, are critical for your arts organization to resume normal operations? So you want to think about those, and then you want to figure out what your strategy is. So how are you going to garner critical resources if you need them? There's all sorts of advice out there. You can contract with third parties. You can enter into reciprocal agreements with other partners. Again, you can pause certain activities or programs until things are fully operational. But you really want to include the staff with in-depth knowledge of business functions and processes, because they're the best folks to determine what will and will not work. They'll have a little bit better insight into the feasibility of these different types of plans. So all those alternative plans, this is where the conversation happens. They should be explored, and they should be, once you have determined the best path, you want to present that to senior management for approval, and then decide how much to spend, what sort of resources or what sort of investments does your organization need to make in order to safeguard itself from potential situations. So that's making the plan. It's a lot of conversation, and it's really based on your BIA, which is why the BIA is so critical. And lastly, I want to talk about testing your plan. That is maybe one of the most critical steps. So you want to develop a testing maintenance plan. So how often are you going to test? What's that going to look like? You also want to have an orientation exercise for folks within your team. And from your tests, you want to document and incorporate those results. Tests are a living document. They grow as the organization grows. So, keep that in mind. It's not something you do once. It's something you might do many times. And there are different levels of testing you can do. You can do anything from a checklist where you just kind of go through and you go check, check, check. We have this, we have that. You can also do a simulation, which is a little bit more interactive. It's going to get team members involve a little more critical thinking. And then you could do like a super in-depth simulation where you've invested some pretty serious time and resources, potentially even support from an outside consultant. And that's probably going to be the best test of your business continuity plan. But again, that might not be the most realistic for your organization based on your budget and your capacity. So try to figure out the testing model that makes the most sense to you. So that's it. That's business continuity kind of in a nutshell in terms of categories of information. I do want to mention, and it's strongly recommended through numerous folks, that you have a whole separate process for ITDRP, Information Disaster Recovery, ITDRP, Information Technology Disaster Recovery Plan. There we go. So this would be a plan that focuses on the recovery and restoration of IT-specific needs after an incident. And so it's could be developed in conjunction or parallel or before or after your business continuity plan. But you're looking at your information technology. How do you restore your hardware? How do you get applications up and going? How do you get data back in the quickest amount of time? And you want to think through different scenarios that are a threat to your IT systems. Some of those may be a lack of access to your data, or potentially a loss of data, which is terrifying to all of us. I was reading that hardware failure or human error is about 75% of all data loss. And then that's followed by theft and hardware destruction. And then lastly, what about a loss of IT function? So you can't access the network. Maybe you can't get on the shared drive. Maybe all your critical files are locked up for some reason. And then lastly, I'm sure we all have some experts in the IT world that we lean on, but what if they leave or they're incapacitated for a period of time? Who has the keys? Who has the knowledge to keep things going? So IT teams would kind of do their own impact analysis and score and potentially risk assessment. And then they'll figure out a plan that's a little bit different because they have different considerations. They're thinking about servers and desktops and laptops and wireless information and all the software and data backup and recovery that's important. So they might have their own testing plans, they might have their own procedures, etc. So it's a process that's running parallel to this business continuity process, but because IT is so critical to all the work that we do, it is a good idea to consider doing that process entirely separate and having a separate team focus on that. So I just want to mention that, ITDRP. And I'm just checking to make sure I'm still on the webinar. I am. I'm thrilled about that. That's a win for the day. I'm not going to spend much time on this. We talked about it last week. Just a tool I want to throw out there again. SurfPlus has a business insurance guide book for artists. I know it says for artists, but still has some really great information about types of business insurance, types of liability, types of other insurance. Also, some information that's relevant to arts organizations. Feel free to check out that recording from last week. But just want to pitch that resource for just a minute. And now we're going to get into the strong resources that I'm hoping to share with you all. The first of which is through the Performing Arts Readiness Project, otherwise known as PAR. As we know, the performing arts sector is hit particularly hard by many events. We saw this within the pandemic when majority of performing artists were out of work for a long period of time. The Performing Arts Project, as you can read, was formed to focus on disasters and emergencies, which can halt performances. They have a lot of different pieces to the work that they do, some great information, some great outreach. I will specifically make a call out to this Business Continuity for Performing Arts Organization webinar. You can find it on their website. Just look under webinars. It's much heavier than what we discussed today. The content is very, very dense. I will suggest you have a pen and paper ready, because basically all the categories I mentioned today, it's going to have a lot of additional details and steps to consider going into. That recording is a heavy hour and a half, but great investment of your time. And definitely encourage you to check that out to deepen your knowledge. When you feel like you've kind of gotten the general concept and are feeling stronger about your next steps regarding business continuity, you also may want to consider this tool that was put together from PAR. It's called D-Plan. It's an online emergency planning and response tool. Really great resource, very affordable. It's about $60 a year, but if you're new to it, you can always write to them, and often they will waive the fee for the first year if that is a barrier for your organization. So definitely consider that as well. They break the information into these 5 steps, starting with a risk assessment and walking you through some exercises. And so that's, they focus on 9 critical areas. So I mentioned everybody has their own secret sauce. Theirs is 9 critical areas, and I'll read those out to you. They're collections and assets, communication, facilities, finance, IT, people, programs, training, and drills. So that is how they're focusing their energy on their risk assessment, but good exercise to get you all more comfortable and focused as you go into your business continuity planning. Secondly, they have something called action items, and that organizes and tracks an organization's action items for emergency preparedness. So it's customizable. You can have task descriptions, priority levels, progress notes, etc. It's a little bit more interactive, just a tool for coordinating your work together on your team. They also have critical stuff, and that's a cloud storage for organizations' most important documentation. Last week, we talked about important documentation, but this could be anything, spreadsheets, text files, links, etc., that you would need for your business continuity planning. So consider that as another resource. They also have reports. They have 10 different reports. That includes contact lists, locations where collections and assets are stored, basic procedures for emergencies, and you can print out those reports and have a hard copy as a backup. Obviously, you can also store those in the cloud. And then lastly, they have a whole section on guides and resources, and they have a module that helps you access those resources. And D-Plan is really great about putting out informational webinars on this program. So if you even Google D-Plan Arts Ready, they have an introductory one. Webinar is about 10 minutes long. They also have a 40-minute one that walks you a little bit more through each of these steps. So if you're curious but not quite ready to commit, there are some great tools online to get you a little bit more familiar with this program. And I mentioned communications, which triggered a light bulb in my brain. Communications plan are also like a super critical part of business continuity. You want to have updated org charts, and you want to know the most recent contact information for your staff. So if you need to inform them of something that's going on, staff and board and other folks associated, you can tell them an incident is happening and send out a message to everybody at once. You also want to consider having templates to put on your website or on social media should an incident arise that kind of get ahead of a story. With social media and so much other information flowing, sometimes misinformation is the biggest threat to our organization, to our brand, and to our reputation. So in terms of business continuity, you also want to think about those templates and that messaging you need to have ahead of time. So that popped into my mind. I just want to make sure I didn't forget to say that communications plan is also a pretty crucial step in your business continuity. Last week, we talked about ready.gov. Ready.gov has some great resources. It's information from the government, but it's free, it's accessible. They have great information on personal preparedness, how to build a kit, how to make a plan, but they also have a whole section for businesses and for organizations. They have something called the Ready Business Toolkit, which has hazard-specific plans for different types of things that happen, and often they're in step-by-step guides. As you can see, they have a whole section on business continuity planning. Theirs look a little bit different than what I said. They have business impact analysis, recovery strategies, plan development, testing and exercises. Same content, slightly different format. But they also have some sample BIA questionnaires. So I know that's a part that feels intimidating because it's got a bunch of words that don't make sense, but they have a link to that on there with some free templates that you can download as well. So definitely check out ready.gov. And then lastly, I'll mention another free resource. FEMA has their own version of business continuity. It's slightly different. This is called COOP, Continuity of Operations Planning. They have free trainings, an introductory course, which I've highlighted here, but a number of more in-depth courses as well on continuity of operations planning, as well as what they call a continuity guidance circular, which is a pretty robust manual for considerations around business continuity planning. So I want to also mention them as well as a free resource if you're feeling like you're not getting enough information out there. This is definitely a good place to go. And something I like about FEMA trainings is that they are laid out very simply. So it's typically they'll provide you content and then they'll kind of give you a sample test at the end just to make sure that it's sticking. I won't do that to you all, but just another resource to consider. And COOP is a little different than business continuity, but similar in concept. So I think that's it. I am going to exit out so I can see you all, and I am really hoping you're there. I think you are. And Hillary, did we get any questions as I'm figuring this out?
I do not see any questions in the question area, but if folks do have questions, they can put it in the question box or the chat, or even raise your hand if you don't mind, Cameron. Someone could ask you directly.
Absolutely, and thank you for putting those resources in there as we're going, Hillary.
Sure.
Any recommendations for where to get risk of loss insurance? Great question. So last week we talked a lot about insurance, and I said very sheepishly at the beginning, I don't give direct recommendations, but our pocket guide, Surplus Pocket Guide, does provide some great information to help you put together a strong business commentary, which is information about the size and scope of your arts organization, as well as some great information on how to navigate that field and select the best insurance and the best underwriter for you. I also mentioned that there's a resource called AM Best that provides free ratings of insurance companies, something that's worth considering. So definitely, if you have 5-10 minutes, feel free to check out that webinar. Otherwise, just dive into that pocket guide. But I wouldn't recommend one insurer over another. I would trust your instinct. I would figure out which questions to ask and have your business commentary ready. And if anything doesn't feel right with the insurer that you're talking to, definitely move on and shop around. You can even sometimes take quotes and kind of bargain with insurers and tell them what other insurance agencies are giving you for a similar type of coverage. So I'm going to answer your question by not really answering your question, but there are some great resources out there.
Any other questions for Cameron? And is that pocket guide known by another name on the website, Cameron, just so I can see if I can find a link to it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I can send you a link directly. You can also just should be able to search by Surf Plus Insurance, and it should come up. While you say that, I'm going to do it. Test myself. Yeah, it's under Get Ready and it's under our insurance hub. I will
We have
drop that.
another question for
Sure.
you.
Let me drop the link right here. Sure.
The question is, I may have missed this, but are there grants to support developing these plans?
Great question. That is a great question. You know, who would be the best resource to answer that would be PAR. PAR, the Performing Arts Readiness, provides free consulting and at times free training on this exact thing. They would be the one to be able to answer that. I know PAR is heavily funded by Mellon, but I don't know if Mellon gives grants for this type of work to other organizations. So definitely recommend connecting with PAR about that. They should be able to point you in the right direction. That's a really good question. I'm going to research that for my own knowledge.
Any other questions?
If not, I will just say, don't be intimidated by business continuity planning. It sounds terrifying. It sounds really intense, but it doesn't have to be. You just have to be really thoughtful, intentional, and with as much comfort and capacity and ability as your organization has, try to be rigorous, but don't be scared of all the terms. Don't be scared of doing it incorrectly. Even having, a minimal business continuity plan is helpful. Just having updated org charts, just thinking through certain scenarios, that is still helpful in and of itself, even if it's not the most polished and beautiful business continuity plan in the world.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait,
Great.
no, yes, we do have one. If we are a small organization, what is the most important thing to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you're a small organization, I would say, and I'm in a small organization too, just for full disclosure, I would say one of the most important things to do is understand your risk and assets. I think that is a first step for all of this. If you don't have a good sense of what your assets are, of what's critical to your organization continuing its operations, then it's really hard to plan. So think through do a risk assessment and also list out your assets, and then try to start putting together a few of those scenarios. Just having those general conversations is great. And again, make sure you do have an updated communication plan and think through, like, if you lost access to your data or to your email, what would you do? How would you work around that? Start having some of those conversations around specific scenarios. And so our organization tries to do this as well. And I will tell you, even though we have very little transition, every year the team forgets what we talked about the year before. And we forget what the plan was. We forget who's on point for what. Is that my responsibility to monitor the weather? I forgot that. So it's good to just continue having those conversations. Don't just do this once. Try to do this as frequently as you can, because you'll be surprised how quickly this information seems really important, and then you forget about it because you go back to your day-to-day work. But then when an incident happens, you don't want to be running around and panicked and really making decisions with bad information. That's what business continuity is trying to prevent. is making a really critical organizational decision without proper considerations.
Okay, last call for questions. Anyone have anything they want to enter the chat or raise your hand? Okay, well, thank you so much, Cameron.
Thank
This has
you.
been very informative, and I appreciate you offering all of these resources to our Berkeley arts community. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having me. And thanks again for taking the time out of your day to be here.
Okay. Oh, we got a thank you. Okay, it wasn't a question, it's a thank you in the question box. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.